Welcome to This View of Life, where we take a deep dive with the best and brightest thinkers on anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. I am your host, David Sloan Wilson. For more interviews, articles, videos, and special publications, search for This View of Life on your favorite search engine. Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for This View of Life, and so pleased to be talking to my friend and colleague, Elliott Sober. Hello, Elliott.
Hello, David. Good to see you again.
And I reached out to you because of a conversation I'm going to have with Bret Weinstein on group selection, which the Twitterverse is greatly looking forward to. And Bret has already got the ball rolling by taping a short interview about this conversation we're going to have from his end. And he said a couple of things in that interview that I really wanted to forestall right away, not to wait for the conversation. And who better to help me out than you? So let me introduce you to our audience. You are a philosopher of biology, one of the best, and on your own started thinking about multi-level selection, especially in regard to sex ratio, but in general, which you wrote about in your book, The Nature of Selection, which came out in 1984. And then we got together around that time and started writing papers. I think our first paper was in 1989. We had a behavioral and brain sciences paper in 1994, and then we wrote our book, Under Others, in 1998, which I'm proud to say has withstood the test of time. And one of your more recent books, a really lovely book called Did Darwin Write the Origin Backwards, a series of essays. And one of the essays was about what Darwin thought about group selection. And that was one of the points that Bret made that I wanted to forestall, that many others have portrayed Darwin as basically an individualist, not a group selectionist, but an individual selectionist. In fact, there's a whole string of juicy quotes by people like Dawkins and Richard Alexander and Michael Gislin and George Williams and others about how Michael Ruse, about how Darwin was a individual selectionist. Actually, this is not true at all, and you've done a very scholarly job of showing that in one of your essays. And in that same essay, you actually do a good job of just portraying the current scene, basically. So it's a great essay to read. I actually think we should contact the publisher and see if they can make that chapter available online. We'll try to do that. So let's begin with this question of was Darwin a group selectionist? And why don't you just begin, and then I'll chip in again soon enough.
Okay, chronologically, I think what happened with Darwin is he was thinking about natural selection as a competition among individuals in a single non-specific group. So it was individual selection in the way that term now is understood. But he got stopped dead in his theorizing when he started to think about sterile workers in social insects. And he could see no advantage to the individual insect from being sterile. He knew this was the pervasive phenomenon, and it really puzzled him. And as a characteristic of the deep thinker that he was, he didn't just brush it aside as, oh, let's not worry about that. He really worked at it. And that's, I think, one of the things that drove him to the idea of group selection, that although it's no good for the worker to be sterile, it could be good for the hive or the nest to have a mixture of sterile and fertile individuals in it. So he saw it in terms of group advantage. It didn't take him long to see the relevance of that to the understanding of human morality, which, of course, in the origin, he postponed pretty much all discussion of human evolution. But in the Descent of Man, he took this up again, and he invoked group selection there to explain the pervasiveness of norms of altruism and cooperation in human societies. His picture was that tribes were at war with other tribes, either literally at war or somewhat indirectly by competing for scarce resources with other tribes. And tribes of good cooperators, tribes in which individuals sacrifice their own welfare for the sake of the group, were going to win that competition. And he thought that was a central theme in human evolution. So
Yeah.
human morality that's the most vivid and, of course, close to home example. But it actually started, I think, for him thinking about worker sterility in insects.
Yeah, so and I want to make to me a totally foundational point, which applies to Darwin and the entire subject. The point is this, that group selection is a theory that pertains to social adaptations. If you're not thinking about social adaptations, then there's no need to think about group selection. An individual level adaptation, the sharp tooth of the tiger, the sharp eyesight of the hawk, these evolved. These are traits basically that only influence the fitness of the individual compared to other individuals. There's no place for group selection until you start thinking about adaptations that are for the good of the group. And only then do you confront the dilemma that Darwin confronted, first with the social insects and then with human morality. So one reason that Darwin didn't talk much about group selection was that he was trying to build the entire theory. And for most of that theory, group selection is not relevant until you get to social adaptations. And that's true for the entire development of the field of evolutionary biology, as we'll soon cover. So you more or less agree with that diagnosis?
I do, but I want to modify that a little bit. I mean, what we now call altruism was the jumping off point for Darwin, traits that are deleterious to the individual but beneficial to the group. For Darwin, as well as for contemporary thinkers, that's the salient driving problem that makes people think about group selection. However, conceptually, group selection, as we explain in our book, is not limited to traits in which group and individual advantage are at odds with each other. And Darwin actually has a fascinating example. I have to thank Alex Rosenberg, a fellow philosopher of biology who teaches at Duke, for drawing my attention to this example. Darwin talks about the example of technological innovation in human groups, where an innovator will get a benefit from being an innovator. He or she will have first use of the tool. Darwin talks about snares or weapons. So the innovator gets the weapon or the tool first. And that's an advantage to him or her. But in addition, it's good for the tribe to have innovators in it. So that was an example for Darwin in which a trait will be favored by individual selection and also by group selection. So this was very yes, altruism was the jumping off point for him in his thinking, but he saw that the scope for group selection to affect evolution went beyond altruism.
Yep, absolutely. And I think so, all true. And if we fast forward to the present, then we have concepts such as equilibrium selection among alternative local equilibria. We have, as you cover in the chapter, what if a single trait is favored by both within and between group selection? Does that mean we could ignore group selection? Why would you do that? That kind of thing. But what we can say, I think, and we can say it today, in addition to for Darwin, is that in the case of altruism, in the case of traits that are for the good of the group and at some expense to the individual, group selection becomes indispensable because we're faced with a situation in which the trait we're trying to explain is selectively disadvantageous in each and every group that it occurs in. And so the only solution if that is the case, the only solution to that problem is to add another layer of natural selection. There can be no other solution than to have some positive differential at some larger scale than within groups in order to overcompensate for the negative differential within the groups. There's just no other way around that problem. And that's what Darwin saw, basically. Although it seems to me he saw it gradually. And I think it seems to me that initially he didn't really get this. He thought that his theory could explain everything that had been attributed to a creator. And it was only when he started to think about social adaptations that he realized, no, actually. And you had this fascinating thing. This is, I want to make sure it's mentioned in this interview. Might as well do it right now. Of the progression of his thought being recorded in the subsequent editions of The Origin of Species. So let me read the same paragraph, which he modified between the first, I think, fifth and sixth editions. So in the first edition, he says, in social animals, natural selection will adapt the structure of each individual for the benefit of the community if each, in consequences, profits by the selected change. So this language seems to indicate that for these group beneficial traits to evolve, it has to be beneficial to the individuals. Then, in the fifth edition, he says, in social animals, natural selection will adapt the structure of each individual for the benefit of the whole community. If this in consequence, in other words, the community in consequence, profits by the selected change. And in the sixth edition, he strengthens it even more. In social animals, natural selection will adapt the structure of each individual for the benefit of the community if the community profits by the selected change. And so it's like Darwin, not only was he thinking about group selection, but the more he thought about it, the more he was signing on to it, right?
Right. Yeah.
So
He was clarifying his commitment, subsequent revisions. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is, so I think that anyone who reads your essay, I would like to think, will have to agree that in the first place, you can't just say that Darwin seldom talked about group selection when in fact he had the whole theory of natural selection to present to the world. And whenever he did confront this one problem of social adaptations that for the good of the group, he was remarkably subtle and nuanced in his thinking. He even thought about the problem of how there can be variation among groups in the first place, because if you imagine a new trait evolving by mutation, then what do you have? You have one group with this trait at a very low frequency because it's a mutant trait, and then you have other groups in which trait doesn't exist at all. How do you get that trait to become common within a single group? And that bothered him. And he invoked reputation and some things like that in order to explain how that might be. One thing he didn't get, which the modern literature does, is that this idea that traits originate as mutations and therefore exist at a very low frequency does not apply to quantitative traits. If it's a quantitative trait, then it always has a mean and a variance. And so the variation among groups is much simpler to explain than if you just have a mutant trait. So this is one of these things that the modern literature has sorted through, but which is largely unknown to the general public. So there's one point I want to make, so happy to make with you, about what Darwin thought about group selection. Now, the next point, and the next thing one of the things that Bret does is something that's very familiar to us because it exists again and again and again in the literature, which is to describe the fundamental problem that selfishness beats altruism within groups. In a group with altruists, if you toss in a selfish individual, that selfish individual has the advantage. This is the fundamental problem of social life that Darwin encountered whenever he thought about social adaptation. So there's the problem. But what happens so often, Dawkins did this in the introduction to Selfish Gene, many, many others have done it, is to treat that as the whole story. The fact that there's a selective disadvantage within groups is the reason that altruism doesn't evolve. One group selection, of course, is the other half of the story. That because thanks to variation among groups, then actually the altruistic trait does evolve despite that selective disadvantage, but that often gets left out of the account. Now, I forgive Bret for leaving it out because it was just a very short introduction, but everyone should know that what multi-level selection is all about is, in the first place, yes, this potential selective disadvantage of altruism within groups, not always, because we've already covered the fact that some traits evolved are favored by both, but also between group selection as the force that can nevertheless select for these traits. You've got to tell both sides of the a story, and by now there's ample evidence that that other side of the story cannot be ignored, cannot be called invariably weak, and so on and so forth. So I'm talking too much here. Let me pass the baton to you.
Let me just add to what you just said. So if you imagine a single group as the subversion from within argument that Dawkins put forward does, if a single group with altruist and selfish individuals, yes, by definition, the selfish individuals will be more successful than the altruists, and so selfishness will increase in frequency and eventually go to 100%. And that story has only one group in it, namely that one. And there's no variation among groups for the trait, and therefore group selection is assumed not to exist from the very beginning of the story. Group selection requires variation among groups, just like individual selection requires variation among individuals. So one is imagining a situation in which group selection cannot act. And of course, it's true that if that's the case, altruism cannot evolve. The mistake is thinking that that's an argument against group selection. It's simply an argument that assumes there's no group selection and correctly notices the consequence of that, namely that altruism doesn't evolve. It's not an argument against group selection or anything.
Talk a little bit also about the Simpson's paradox, because I think legitimately it's the case. The reason Simpson's paradox, which you're about to describe, is called a paradox is because it really is subtle. I mean, so smart people get confused by Simpson's paradox, and Simpson's paradox has applications that have nothing to do with group selection. So tell us what Simpson's paradox is.
It's hard to do without a blackboard and a little bit of numbers to visualize it. But let me give you an example that my colleague, philosopher of science Nancy Cartwright, made the philosophy of science community aware of some decades ago. This is a true story. University of California at Berkeley was alarmed to notice that women were getting into grad school less frequently than men, and they were worried that there was discrimination against women within the university. And the strange thing that happened next was that when each department in the university was investigated, it turned out that within each department, men and women got in with equal frequency. If 10% of the men got in, 10% of the women. If 20% of the men got in, 20% of the women. And this seemed crazy. Like, how could women get in Berkeley less frequently than men if within each department, women got in just as often as men? It seems crazy, but that's the paradox. And the way to start seeing how this can happen is that women were applying to departments that are harder to get into than men were applying to. So there was fairness within departments, but the effect that women and men were applying to different departments had the effect that women were getting in less frequently than men. So that's an example, which is kind of abstract, but you can visualize how what's true within a group, within each group in a population, within each department in a university, can fail to generalize to the whole university or the whole metapopulation group.
Yeah, so to nail that.
Now carrying that over to altruism. So it's true by definition that in mixed groups, altruists will be less fit than selfish individuals. But it could turn out that when you average over these different groups, which have different frequencies of altruism, that altruists are on average fitter than selfish individuals. That's the weird thing that goes by the name of Simpson's paradox. And it's formally the same phenomenon as the sex discrimination at Berkeley example.
Example, if the engineering department has mostly men applying and the nursing department has mostly women applying, and the engineering department is taking in more students than the nursing department, then there's your bias right there. It's at the between department level. And and so the counterpart for multi-level selection is that the groups of altruists are contributing more to the total population than the groups of with mostly selfish individuals. So there's a differential at the group level, which is favoring the altruists, despite their selective disadvantage within groups. I want to provide an example. I want to segue as our final piece of this to kind of the sociology of this controversy. And something which I think is common, which is like a kind of a priority effect, that the first contributions have a disproportional influence, kind of things get in stone, set in stone on the basis of the first contributions. And even when they deserve to be overturned, then it doesn't have nearly the impact, especially when the conclusion sort of resonates with the cultural zeitgeist or milieu. So the specific example is one of the most influential early models of group selection was the Haystack model of John Maynard Smith. You describe it in your chapter, and in that model, he imagines haystacks which are colonized by single fertilized female. There's an altruistic allele and a selfish allele. And of course, the altruistic allele is selected against within each haystack, but ultimately they disperse from their haystacks. And so there's the group selection part. So Maynard Smith did include both parts of the story, but as a simplifying assumption, and we have to remember that back then, this was during the days before desktop computing and the ability to do sophisticated computer simulation models. As a simplifying assumption, he assumed that in every haystack which had at least one selfish allele, those haystacks went to fixation, in other words, all selfish, before the dispersal phase. And so I don't know whether he intended it or not, but he made within group selection in favor of selfishness as strong as it could possibly be. And so therefore he concluded that group selection is weak, and therefore, and ironically, in fact, totally paradoxically, in retrospect today, he didn't see that the haystack model was a kin selection model, despite the fact that the mice in the haystack are siblings.
Right.
So go figure. So, but in any case, in 1987, I revisited the haystack model, and it was exactly the same as Maynard Smith's model, and except I relaxed that assumption. I simply let the altruistic allele decline in frequency according to the benefits and costs of Hamilton's rule, actually, Hamilton's equation. So it was also true in my model that the selfish gene was increasing in frequency every generation, but it didn't have to go to fixation. And at the same time, the most altruistic haystacks were growing faster than the less altruistic haystacks. And now we had, both sides of the story one more time, except in this case, altruism robustly evolved. If Maynard Smith had given my model in 1964, the whole history of the subject would have been different. But my model, despite the fact that it was published in an obscure journal titled Evolution, the flagship journal for the field, had a negligible impact. I'm not doing sour grapes here. What I'm noting is the degree to which, when a consensus is reached, even when it's reached by scientists, it is extraordinarily difficult to go back. And that also goes for Hamilton. As you know, when Hamilton encountered the work of George Price, he was happy to say that kin selection is a form of group selection, and said it in a paper in 1975. And yet even Hamilton was not able to reverse this individualistic tide, this tide that everything is individualistic, which I think is perhaps the real kind of culprit as to why this controversy refuses to go away, is that it is so resonant with larger cultural forces during our time, during the last half century, that renders and that wants to render everything as a form of individual self-interest. Think of neoliberal economics, think of methodological individualism in the in the social sciences that you don't understand something unless you understand it in terms of individual self-interest. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting sociological hypothesis. I think it's a challenge to think about how one could test it, but no, I like the idea. It's worth pursuing. There's another part of the histories of biology here that is sort of separable from the individualism paradigm, and that's the increasing emphasis on mathematical modeling that was taking flight in the 60s. It didn't start in the 60s, but that was a very big deal. And unfortunately, the people who were sympathetic with group selection didn't step up to the plate and give models. And the people on the other side came up with 15 reasons why group selection was nonsense, a mixture of horrible and not so horrible arguments. But I think a lot of what made the tide so powerful was that the group selectionists didn't know how to fight back. They had verbal arguments about why it seemed right, but the sort of model that would show how altruism can evolve in a metapopulation, even though it's disadvantageous within groups, they didn't say, look at the algebra of this model. That was not there. So they were really fighting with one hand tied behind their back.
We're getting into the weeds here, or we're taking a deep dive, which is just fine. That's what we do. And I'm going to push back on that, and then we'll take this on. We'll call it quits for this
Okay.
Interview. So I actually disagree with that. But this enables me to make another important point. It wasn't just Darwin that said little about group selection because he had so much else to talk about. This was also true for the entire field of evolutionary biology. And so if you look at the fathers of population genetics, Haldane, Fisher, Wright, and they had the whole apparatus of population genetics. And now we're talking about theory, of course. It's remarkable that each one said something about group selection and altruism, but very little, just like Darwin, because they had so much else on their plates, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But one briefly considered this problem that of social adaptations being selectively disadvantageous within groups, gestured towards group selection as the solution. Their particular conception of groups differed, and that's interesting because it's when you're faced with the dilemma or the problem of within group selection weighing against altruism that you have to add another layer of natural selection. But exactly how you do so depends. And so the particular conception of groups for all three of them were different from each other. Sewell Wright's shifting balance theory was, for the most part, not about social adaptations, but about individual level traits with complex a basis. And he only talked about group selection in a book review, for heaven's sakes, of a book
Right.
by Simpson. Then we get to George Williams, and paradoxically, this is something that you have to be a scholar to know. But I'm happy to provide a window to scholarship. Do y'all out there in Twitterland know that George C. Williams and his wife Doris wrote an article in 1957, which was a group selection model for social insects? Do you know that? And so these were what I think I'm trying to say is that sympathetic models about group selection are present from the beginning, all the way back to the fathers of population genetics. You have Borman and Levitt. You have Lemon. I mean, I can cite the. Now, what those showed, though, and this is a point worth making, is that given the tools available for modeling at the time, which required severe simplifying assumptions, and given the particular conception of groups, mostly as demes, multi-generational demes, as opposed to social groups that could be much more transient. What's called the trait group model, which is one of my contributions, was to basically generalize the concept of groups. Basically, my main contribution was to say a group is the set of individuals that are socially interacting with each other. That's what a group is. If it's a social adaptation, then you can't calculate the fitness of an individual unless you know not only its own phenotype, but the fitness of others with whom it interacts.
Right.
The model is a function. The fitness of the individual is a function of the number of individuals and the composition of the individuals with whom it interacts. Let's make that the group of group selection models. But that was kind of an innovation. And before that, a group was an island. It was a deme.
Right.
As it turns out, even those
reproductive community.
So there's all this progress that was made. In 1975, Michael Gilpin wrote a whole book on group selection that began to introduce complex interactions and the fact that when the groups are subject to complex interactions, then there can be a kind of variation among groups based on nonlinearities that did not exist in the simpler models. So that was a whole book published by Princeton University Press in 1975. Then you have Hamilton, you have the Price equation, which was more modeling. And so, and the Price equation became celebrated as an elegant statistical partitioning method, all of that. And as far as the field as a whole, all of that fell on deaf ears. And here we are in 2018, going on 19, and we still have this, not among the cognoscenti. So there's another point, is that if you read the actual peer-reviewed literature, then the concept of equivalence, something we're not going to get to, is de rigueur. Back then, it was mandatory to say, my model does not invoke group selection, or my study does not invoke group selection. Now it is mandatory to say, oh yes, there's this thing called equivalence. And so basically kin selection and what I'm talking about can be modeled as multi-level selection or kin selection, so on and so forth. But the stasis, the cultural stasis, the refusal to attend to the academic literature is, I want to say extraordinary, but I think that if you look at other major controversies, you find that they're also decadal, and that it also takes them maybe a half century to iron itself out. I don't know, but I'm done with my rant. I'm done.
Yes, there's inertia and extreme division of labor, so that people in a field defer to the people they think are the experts and are happy to do so, because then they can go on to do things that they are expert in. So a lot of the opinions formed in a community of biologists are not, individuals are not forming their views independently of each other. They're listening to each other and taking the word of people who are supposed to know what they're talking about.
Yep, and with their predilection, so that certain way. And if there's a single expert that seems to fit into that, then they'll glom onto that.
When I was talking about the absence of modeling, I wasn't talking about the 70s. I was talking about Wynne Edwards and before. And as you said, there was the very brief discussion among the architects of population genetics, Fisher, Haldane, and Wright, but nothing very persuasive about, and actually very skeptical about altruism and group selection, briefly described, and then the impetus to write models became very important in biology, and group selection got swept up in that.
Yeah.
And it happened later that these models were actually developed, but by then the sweep had occurred in the 60s.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, this is great, Elliott. I'm so happy to have had this conversation with you and to make it available as preparation for the conversation that I'm going to have with Bret Weinstein.
Well, great talking to you, David.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for listening to This View of Life. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe in iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please consider rating it on iTunes and leaving a review to help others find the show. This View of Life is produced by the Evolution Institute, a non-profit think tank whose mission is to provide science-based solutions for today's most pressing social issues in order to improve the quality of life. Learn more at evolution-institute.org. And if this view of life is important to you, then type TVOL 1000, TVOL 1000, to see how you can join the Darwinian Revolution.